The emergency state was described by a physiologist back in 1950 named Hans Selye, and he found that whenever something happens that we perceive or conceive of as threatening to our existence, in any form we go into what's called an emergency state. That's a physiological truth, so that when that happens, the body mobilizes itself to gear us up for dealing with the emergency. So we go into what he termed the fight or flight response. And I think everybody is probably watching this is aware of the fight or flight as a natural, normal phenomenon in everyday life experience. So if there is an acute threat that's, that we encounter, the body will, through the hormonal system, will throw into the mix pituitary hormone, thyroid hormone, pancreatic hormone, the storage substance from the liver called glycogen, the sugar storage substance. The adrenal glands will throw in epinephrine. From the adrenal medulla, from the cortex of the adrenal, will come the steroids. And then, of course, the muscles begin to tighten, and we start to create substances from that muscle tightening and contraction. And we have neuromuscular tension begins to take place, where we become a virtual pharmacy within our system. And there has to be some outlet for the substances that have gathered in our body framework. So we either can flee or we can fight. And fleeing also includes lapsing into coma or into unconsciousness as a form of fleeing, actual running away, or fighting. And in such an experience allows us to discharge all of these built-up products, which are all enable us to deal with the emergency at hand. Turns out that most emergencies that we conceive of or perceive are misconceptions and misperceptions because they are essentially false emergencies. And I call that the phenomenon. So your check didn't come in the mail that you were depending on to pay the rent. Or you were waiting for that phone call from your special friend to tell you something, and it didn't come. So you're running to get the bus, and you got to catch it, and the doors close, and it begins to take off, and so on. So these are going on constantly in our daily life, and we are going through lots of different emergency states all the time, which we call false emergencies, simply because those emergencies don't mean that your life is at stake. There's no one holding a gun to your head about to blow your brains out, which could be the model that you could use as to define a true emergency. That is, that your life is at stake at this moment. Everything else that's perceived or misperceived rather, or misconceived as an emergency does not involve your life being at stake at this moment, even the diagnosis of cancer. So there is no true emergency, even if you feel that it is, when you misperceive or misconceive. The story that sort of kind of highlights this is the story from India, where two men are walking through a forest, and one jumps back, and the other one says, "What's wrong?" And he said, "There's a snake over there, a cobra." And the other one takes a look, and he walks over and he picks it up. He says, "See, it's only a rope. You misperceived the rope as a snake." And of course what happened from that is that we concocted a whole story about what could happen to us, because every one of these emergencies that we make up through the misperception and misconception will be a projection into a time, place, and circumstance that doesn't exist, called the future. That's a spiritual point. For the spiritual life, the future doesn't exist. It's at best a potential or a possibility, but it's not here now, even though we do treat these experiences as though they're here now and present right before us, and they're not. They're projections either into something that doesn't exist or something that once existed, called the past, that is gone, over, ended, done, finished, buried, doesn't exist anymore. So we treat all of that as though it's here right now. What do we do when the false emergency takes place? We have to take stock of the situation, and that's another form of a stopping phenomenon that I described elsewhere, in that when that happens and you become aware that you're in an emergency state, which you'll know because you'll feel ill at ease. You'll feel a dis-ease, D-Y-S, a dis-ease, a malaise. You will feel uncomfortable and distressed. That's the signal to ask yourself, what is the emergency that's going on here? Is it and find out the answer for that. It'll come if you ask. And ask, is this a true emergency or false emergency? And you have to be frank and honest with yourself that it is, whether your life is truly at stake, is there a gun to your head and your brain's about to be blown out at this moment? Regardless of the feeling as though it is. It has to be the fact of the matter. Once you discover that it's a false emergency, you make a comment, not to yourself, but just a general comment to what we might call, or who we might call, the higher self, and make a comment to that higher self that this is a false emergency state, and that Jerry, in this case myself, is creating a false emergency which doesn't exist, and the feelings that are attendant to it, the anxiety, the worry, the panic, or whatever it is, has no value, because those feelings are just merely fuel stoking the engine of the emergency state, and they have no value, only because they're giving life to something that's not true. And our work in the spiritual life is to deal with truth and freedom, and at some point we'll get to the third element, conscience. So that is it true or not true? And we're having to tell our higher self that Jerry is engaged in an untruth. I hope that all of you don't use my name when you're dealing with this, but use your own name, and be willing to tell yourself whether something is true or not. Once you tell yourself that it's untrue, and you take a distance from it, and you create, as we mentioned before, a space, and you just distance yourself and make a space between you and that misperception and misconception, you're immediately going to feel different. And that difference will bring to you a calm and a sense of centeredness and balance. And in that moment, you may also ask yourself, what is the perception or misconception or misperception? And once that takes place, you can change that by your image to something different. So that you, for example, the man who sees the snake, who's misperceived it, he can change it, and his partner showed him that it was a rope. So if he changes and he says, oh, I see, the perception now that I imagine is not a snake but a rope, that changes the whole feeling tone and texture of the situation. So now we're in a different state of being, and we've now allowed some different flow of light to come into our existence, and we're in a better frame of mind. That's a constant practice that we need to do every day, because it's happening to you from the moment you got up to the moment you looked at this video. There was an emergency state, at least one, that happened today. So we can ask ourselves always, what does the emergency look like? And when we do it, when we see what it is, we change it, we take a distance from it, we reverse it, turn it around, shift it to some other form of image that creates a sense of well-being and comfort.